And I'm very honored and blessed to have a fantastic panel with me today to cover exactly that topic around cybersecurity. Maybe just it's appropriate to start with a short introduction. You would have seen the bios in the programs as well and so on, but let me maybe just say a couple of words. So I guess let's go down the list here. First, we have Andile Ngcaba, and an impressive CV indeed. I think he would struggle to write the short bio, to be honest. Started off as the Director General of Communications. That was one of his previous employees for South Africa. That was obviously part of our first government that was democratically elected. And from there on, in about 2003, Andile left to join the private sector. And right now, he's the founder and majority shareholder of investment group Convergence Partners. And some interesting facts about that, Convergence Partners specifically, quite involved in the connectivity side. There's a CCOM cable and a couple of others, the Intelsat, New Dawn. I guess it's just a who's who in terms of technology and at least network implementation in South Africa. And then I know a couple of areas Andile hasn't written in his bio, but he's quite involved in the 4IR work around some of the government initiatives around that, and then just in general the technologist, I guess. So Andile, welcome, and indeed honored to have you on this panel. Then perhaps just introduce Kovelin Naidoo. He is the cybersecurity officer at First National Bank at FNB. Or I guess First Rand would be another way of phrasing it, but Kovelin, you can help us with that. But since joining the company, Kovelin has really helped in the implementation of enterprise-wide cybersecurity and driving the program around that. And then an interesting tidbit I see he added to the bio, finalist in the Titans Building Nations Awards and recognizing men who play a significant role in the sustainable development of the economy. He was one of the brave ones that also stuck in these years of experience, over 21 years of experience in the cybersecurity industry. So also very honored to have him on board. And then last and certainly not least, we have Ursula. And Ursula joins at this stage, holds a position, senior manager of fraud services in BankservAfrica, but really a distinguished career leading up until this point. And because of the role they perform, and she has been performing for quite a while, really on the forefront of understanding how transacting and developments in our banking systems and transacting systems really influence how we should think about things and work through things. And so if there's somebody to ask around the risk around innovation and understanding, and having seen many implementations, some go well and others not so well, I think Ursula is just a wealth of knowledge for us to tap into today. So welcome to our panelists, and it's fantastic to have you guys here. Then we also thought to have a little bit of fun today. We'll see how that works. If it doesn't work out well, that is fine. It will be one of those early fails of Agile, try it out and see how it goes. So we're asking you just to log on to menti.com. If you haven't used it before, it's essentially just some polling technology. And we thought we'd ask you a very easy question. And the question on there, and I'll give you the code in a second, but the question on there in essence, just ask you whether or not you think South Africa is prepared for the cybersecurity risks associated with FinTech. So easy answer, and that's more or less where the panel discussion is going to go. So if you don't want to vote early, let us know. You can vote later. You can log on at any time. You can vote once per device. We're certainly not going to audit this, but it's just for a little bit of fun to sort of get a poll of the feeling out there of where we lie in terms of addressing this problem. All right, so the code I promised, so once you land on menti.com, the code is 3520869. 3520869, and I believe that'll be posted in the chat as well, so you should be able to pick it up out of there. All right, so that's, I think, enough of me talking. Let's really get the brains trust involved in this thing. And as you heard, we're going to discuss cybersecurity risks associated with FinTech. So the current scenario certainly created fertile ground for FinTech and cybersecurity. And if you listen to any of the previous conversations during the day and the rest of the festival, I'm sure the fact that we're all working from home and our environment has changed has popped up quite a bit. And that kind of introduces fertile ground for the adoption of new technologies, new ways of doing things. And although FinTech has been going strong up until recently, I do think that's going to be quite a bit of an accelerator. So within that context and thinking about cybersecurity, perhaps I can start with Andile and just ask Andile, could you discuss what you see as the macro trends that sets the scene for FinTech, mostly pushing generic areas around maybe connectivity increase, traffic increase, things like that, but macro trends you see and what that does for FinTech and cybersecurity related to it. Thanks, Andile.
Thank you very much, Gerhard. Thanks to all the colleagues here in this panel. Thank you for, that introduction. Yeah, a lot of things are happening. One can look at them as trends that have been happening for some time, or one can look at them as, the spike that we have seen now during COVID. Now, I'm just going to talk about just briefly two things. One, we all know that connectivity is central to either functioning of financial institutions or between financial institutions and ordinary people. Whether you are sitting using your mobile device, or whether you're using your computer, whether you're using your iPad, or you're connected via television, or any form or means, basically, that connect you, whether via Wi-Fi or 4G, now 5G, or ultimately optic fiber. Now, one of the things we have seen during the COVID period is an increase in traffic by about 600%. That's a big number of internet traffic increasing in the pipes of the world. Now, just to explain connectivity, what we see in connectivity is that the biggest traffic of the internet is inside the data center. The second biggest traffic is between one data center and the other. The third one is from me or you or an enterprise accessing the data center. All these routes are vulnerable from a cybersecurity point of view. Inside the data center, between one data center and the other, and from me and you or an enterprise or office to the data center. It is therefore very critical that when we look at connectivity, we do this holistically rather than look at it as individuals. There are groups in the world today that are looking at coordination in terms of what we see as traffic across global networks, across submarine cable systems, across satellite networks. Now, this basically community of the connectivity community in the world has realized that if each one of us are trying to find out what's happening in your network, you might not see something basically, but something will be coming later today or tomorrow, whether that is your client being put on a ransomware, whether phishing, or whether, for instance, these highly customized attacks, for instance, or spam or anything, unless we coordinate as the community, as the industry, those involved in networks, those involved in applications, whether these are core banking applications or FinTech applications on the edge in mobile devices. It is that work that we should all do as a community that can address this. So we have then seen through the UN, through, the World Bank, through ICANN, through various organizations in the world, in particular through, for instance, the World Health Organization, because of the spike that we have seen during COVID, that has really caused problems for people. Because as people were moving online, buying online, because they can't travel because of lockdown, a lot of scams have happened. We have never seen the type of problems we have seen during this period. Let me stop here.
I think that's a great intro, and thank you for that. Just a reminder to the audience, you're welcome to post questions. We are going to try and get to them a little later, so please, you can submit while we're talking, or we'll open a little bit of opportunity later. So if you have any specific questions, you're welcome to indicate a specific panel member if you want, but if you don't, that's fine. We as a panel will handle that. And thanks for that intro, Andile. I think there were some great observations in there. You sort of ended up with the increase in scams and things like that, and I think that's a world that Kovelin really understands. But Kovelin, perhaps maybe let's start a little more generic. So if you could discuss a little bit of a banking view on current trends and how that's kind of playing out in cybersecurity related to FinTech. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Gerhard. Thank you, Dr. Ngcaba. I think some very, very important points that I'll pivot off as well with regards to a holistic lens with regards to cybersecurity. So I think at the outset, if we look at where we're evolving to and where we started off in terms of information security professionals, right? And as the world of cyber and digitization and always on IR tech has evolved, we evolved into the cybersecurity domain, right? And it's a fast-moving domain. However, where we sit at the moment, we've now moved into the cyber risk landscape, alluding to the point that you mentioned, Gerhard, with regards to these scams, etc., where we're seeing a huge evolutionary step in terms of tier one syndicates that have adopted cyber-enabled crime models to traditional revenue streams. So bad guys, in essence, versing themselves in IR and digital technologies to apply their trade, and you are in material proportions. So we are now firmly entrenched in the cyber risk space, right, with each and every element of your business operating model, including the technology building blocks in terms of information and cybersecurity, on-prem and off-prem, right? And I think if we had to look at some of the trends associated with some of the cyber risk we're starting to see, I think there's two key lenses, right? One is a technology lens we need to accept, and we're seeing, and the other is a lens of ecosystem and trust. Now, Dr. Ngcaba started off, I think, talking about those FOB IR building blocks. And if I could just elaborate on a few more nuances that we're seeing in there, right? So as a technologist, first and foremost, it's an exciting space for us to be in, right? However, what we're also seeing is that these key FOB IR technological building blocks like AI and machine learning, key technologies like 5G rollouts, and there's even talk about 6G. I'm not even sure how far that is. But connectivity and 5G rollouts is within a COVID lens is very important, in terms of talking to the underbanked. But it's also more important because what COVID has done is accelerated the adoption of a lot of these technologies from an end user point of view, and from an ecosystem and a value chain point of view, banking and non-banking, right? A lot of folks say that, we've come to the end of Moore's Law. Moore's Law is dead. I think that's a bit premature. I mean, we've seen huge developments in computing power still, and that's just advancing the capabilities of AI, machine learning, etc., those building blocks. That's resulted in a seismic shift in terms of technology possibilities, right? If we acknowledge that technology is an enabler for everything we're talking about, FinTech, disruption in most of the ecosystems out there, right? Another important nuance that I'd like for us to acknowledge is that the pace of this technology change, those cycles are a lot shorter. If we look at the old cycles in terms of centralized, heavy data centers, and then we moved into virtualization, and that evolved into cloud, as we know, and then hybrid cloud, etc., and now platform. Those were kind of step changed kind of cycles, which did take, which were much longer. However, where we are now with the COVID kind of lens across the global economic landscape, we're starting to see shorter technology cycles. And I'm talking about businesses adopting these new cycles to increase those revenue streams, to get to customers in new and innovative ways, etc. Right? And another example of how short these cycles are and how fast the innovation is happening, if we look at some of the blockchain type of technologies that's coming out, as an example, decentralized computing and rendering services that's based on blockchain. An example of that is the Golem network. You may have never heard of it, but it's something that you could watch out for in the future, where the premise is, we're all sitting with these huge high-end MacBooks and end computing devices at home, and what the Golem network promises is that you could now rent out that computing power sitting on your desktop for rendering services. So people like the Netflixes and the Amazon Primes and the traditional Hollywood kind of industries now could actually rent out computing power at a much cheaper rate, reducing data center cost, energy consumptions for data centers. So those are emerging tech that's starting to evolve rapidly, whilst we still grapple with getting a handle of the cyber risk in our current space, right? The other lens that's important in terms of driving trends, etc., linked back to the banking ecosystem, is our ecosystem and the trust in there, right? No bank is an island, whether you're a startup, FinTech, wherever you are. I mean, banks, regulators, payment processors, gateways, we've all relied on those old, tried and trusted payment rails, stuff that I think Ursula might talk about in her slot, right? But those rails are modernizing globally, right? Like we've seen modernization of API rails for payments, etc., right? And this talks to these new building blocks that are coming in, right? We're also seeing service providers and non-traditional third parties enter the value chain of payments, right? Where we've got third parties that aren't necessarily in the same regulatory kind of space, governance space, cyber maturity space as we've seen in traditional financial ecosystems globally, right? And this is great because, yes, with the new tech and the new entrants and using the new 4th IR building blocks as enablers, we're starting to see a lot more value coming out to customers out there, right? Which is great. However, the cornerstone of banking has always been trust, right? So I think one of the challenges we're going to have as participants, as regulators, whilst we embrace innovation and embrace the seismic shift and the adoption of this new 4th IR tech, is also ensuring that we don't introduce systemic risk. And part of that challenge is going to be around regulation, right? The pace of regulation, as well as standards. Standards are going to be incredibly important, especially with non-financial type participants and third parties in this ecosystem, right? So embracing this change is great, and I think we're starting to see the value, especially during a COVID period. However, I think where we need to work on is that risk mitigation in terms of cyber risk is across the layers of organization, not just at a technological layer, not just at a platform layer, right? Regulation and real-time assurance around cyber threat visibility around these new payment rails, above the line payment rails and below the line payment rails, is going to be very important and top of mind in terms of systemic risk mitigation. So I'd like to leave it there in terms of setting the scene around technology and our ecosystem of trust.
Some fantastic insights there, and I think when you spoke around the sort of rapid cycles and things like that, Ursula was just nodding and thinking how that affects the world. But Ursula, maybe you can chat to us exactly around that. So the trends that you've been seeing around transacting and the FinTech influence and all these fast cycles and so on. Thank you.
Thanks, Gerhard. And it's very interesting to hear Andile and Kovelin talk, because the convergence of information that's coming together is really setting the trend in terms of how everything actually is starting to be interlinked from a fraud aspect. And everyone's got a spot on, the digitization of the world's economy and the real-time desire for instant payments is driving unprecedented changes in how we and how fraudsters actually do business today. Legitimate and illegitimate payments share the same rails, they cross over the same channels, and knowingly or unknowingly, they're sharing the same customer base. So fintechs are definitely impacting the financial sector on a global scale. I mean, if we take a step back, fintechs were introduced as a technology that sat at the back-end systems of financial institutions and banks. Since then, the definition has changed significantly and continues to evolve. And the mobile phone was designed to make a call. Now it enables you to make a payment. You can even video conference while driving your car. Up until last year, the ordinary person can now trade in stocks. They can process their own orders. They can manage their own funds. They can raise money from a business, from a startup perspective, pay for their insurance and their food via their mobile phone without any human interaction at all. We've mentioned as well, in terms of the banking sector, how fintechs have not only revolutionized the way we engage with our money and our finances, but the opportunity for people who have never had access to financial services before now get access to those financial services without even opening up a bank account. So the move from transacting has definitely forced some banks to take a look at abandoning the brick and mortar concept, moving more towards omni-channels and branchless banking, adopting digital channels such as online, social, and e-wallets. Whether you love it or hate it, understand it or not, blockchain provides the ability to instantly transfer money and other financial assets. Bitcoin can do that transfer in minutes. And then you've got other blockchain platforms like Ripple that are now being able to do that in seconds. So this means that instant transfers, the value of money, no intermediary, no minimum funds and fees, are really putting some pressure onto the banking communities, because their income streams are going to be impacted if we don't start adopting those into our value chains. And customers are going to go where things are either free or that they are much cheaper. So fintechs have definitely introduced new competitors in terms of enabling customers to be able to choose which banks and how they want to engage with their banks. But there's also the pros and cons in terms of how fintechs are influencing our sectors. And that is definitely, we've seen an increase in fraud and cyber risk. But at the same time, we're seeing the exponential acceleration of AI and money laundering, which is becoming so important to us in order to be able to detect fraud and mitigate against financial crime. So the ability to aggregate data, the ability to be able to use and to do deep dives into unstructured transactional data and see a 360-degree view of a customer allows us to be able to process those transactions a lot faster. But more importantly, with machine learning, banks can now use algorithms, they can use historical data in order to be able to predict and determine patterns, which also takes away that time and effort from the manual intervention. So fintech is definitely changing the way we're engaging with our banks and how we're engaging with our money. The question is, what does that look like in the future?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. So Andile, if I can pull you in a little bit, and let's see if we can home in a little on the cybersecurity, because I think that's fantastic context, and I can just imagine, Ursula, how that is affecting your world. So, Andile, could you talk to us around cybersecurity impacts? So due to this increased connectivity and cloud adoption, you touched briefly in your original intro, and you spoke around perhaps us needing some sort of industry collaboration. But maybe you can expand a little more. Thank you.
Yeah, let me thank you very much. I think great comments from colleagues and panelists. I think I'm just going to pick up on one or two things. The first one is, IP addresses, and then linked to that is business email compromise or email in general. I mean, email is still the most used application digitally. I mean, we probably, we take it for granted, but email is one of the most basic, very much used tool to run businesses, big corporations, mid-sized companies, banks, every institution. Email is a very important, tool for the functioning of society. Now, what's underneath an email? It's all the IP addresses, where the IP addresses come from. IP addresses, they come from, institutions, such as Afrinic in our region, or APNIC, or any of these institutions. That hierarchy of ICANN, dealing with IP addresses on one side and domain names on the other. Now, we all know that, if you look at that ecosystem of ultimately having an IP address, whether, or email address as an individual or a block for companies or individuals or families or ordinary people. All this, all this value chain of email, I think it has been compromised, in my view, or IP addresses. I think it's something that we took it for granted for a very long time. How, for instance, either your own internet service provider would provide you, or where you are hosting will provide you with addresses that you then use. Ultimately, you use to engage your bank, or you use, to do transactions online, or you use for whatever purpose. I think, while we sometimes look at a number of issues, I just want to zoom and take a deep dive into this specific issue, because a lot of things then emanate from the email. A lot of crimes emanate. Business email compromise, right? Issues of phishing, they emanate from there. Ransomware, it emanates from there, right? You name it. And then it then cascade and cascade and cascade. But every crime, most of the crimes, whether, for instance, it's a compromise of your digital assets, usually people use email to enter your behind your firewall, right? So I'm saying that as we look at, the infrastructure, as I've said, and the traffic and all these things that are happening, the biggest challenge we are having, in my view, I put it in a very simple, piece of application that is driving business today: email, IP addresses, and the entire value chain basically around that. Now, why people would build firewalls, why people would build end user, for instance, edge computing, and for instance, and device protection software. But with all these, one layer, second layer, third layer firewall, email can, a compromised email can penetrate an organization into any level. And you can relate with it, assuming that Andile is talking to you. Or, for instance, my bankers would think that it is me, and yes, it is not. I really think that, if we can understand, this part of cyber security and cyber crime, that is where a lot of activities are happening. Now, what then happens is that, between the two worlds of the internet, between the light internet, which is, cataloged and indexed, and the unindexed internet, the amount of, for instance, email addresses and passwords that you can now buy, in the dark web, you can buy the entire stock of emails of a big institution with passwords that accompany those emails. I'm saying email is something very important, and we need to understand email. Spammers use email. They hold billions of email addresses of people. So I just wanted to zero into this, that the traffic on the internet is generated from emails. The traffic that we see in all the major roads, it's generated from email. I really think that between the state and society and business, we must think about an alternative means to communicate. I do not believe that securing email can ever be foolproof, can ever be, for instance, where we say that it will, with this email and inside your digital assets, we can be able to protect. Now, we are now going into IoT, and IoT cameras and a number of things. You get informed via email if, for instance, something is happening in your assets, whether those assets, are cameras where you get an information or something like that. I'm just saying, just to zero in the specific issue of business email compromise.
Yep.
In my view, we must not ban the ocean. There are so many problems in so many areas. Don't get me wrong. But I zoom into this because I believe that business email compromise is the biggest challenge of business and society and the state and government.
Okay, and I think Kovelin understands the email compromise side well around scams and things like that as well. And absolutely, the secure email initiatives has been slow on the move. There are some things on the go, but the adoption rate is certainly not being what we need to combat this kind of scams we have seen with business email compromise and the like. So absolutely agreed. So, Kovelin, pulling it back to you. So you spoke a little around this fast cycle and all the new players that are sort of innovating in the space and so on. I was thinking, so who's the weakest link? So how does this whole ecosystem fit? Perhaps you can chat to us around that a little bit.
Great. So thanks, Gerhard. We talked about those fast-paced cycles. We talked about the need for standards and regulation, and the pace of that needing to be a lot faster, right? So if we acknowledge that our ecosystem has already changed, as much as we have, and this is globally, we've got the regular participants that are highly regulated in the current payments and banking stream ecosystem, right, or value chain. And we also have the new participants, right, and let's call them above the line participants in terms of ensuring that processes follow, that there's a strict layer of governance and security, etc. But you also have a need that's being driven by consumer consumption, right? And a change in our end user behavior. It's always on. I'm at home. We've now had people all of a sudden that have always been skeptical about online, and overnight during COVID, everyone's now, well, not everyone, but a large percentage of those folks have now tried to venture out into the e-commerce world, whether it's ordering groceries from your local supermarket online with your credit card for the first time. But these new participants are in there, and there's some sort of learning curve that's going to obviously come with that, right? So we also have non-traditional participants in this ecosystem, and that's only going to grow moving forward, right? What's important is we can talk from a cyber security point of view. We can, and there is a lot of focus, I know, especially within the banking community and ecosystem around APIs, security of APIs, etc. And we have to just take a step back. That's important, right, in terms of security at a technical level, and security in terms of logically where these the interconnectedness of the different participants comes into play, non-traditional and traditional. For example, screen scrapers, right? That would be an example of a non-traditional participant in the payments circle, right? And that's essentially a user going onto an e-commerce site, selecting an instant payment option that they may not fully be aware about from a risk point of view, and then providing their banking username and password on an e-commerce provider's site, which then gets passed on to a third party, which then is used by a bot to log into your banking platform and perform an EFT or a debit transaction immediately. And all of that happens with the bot in 3 seconds using a technology called screen scraping, right? And to a user, that's great, it's fantastic. In 3 seconds, I've made a payment, right? However, from a risk, governance, and assurance point of view, okay, it's a bit cavalier. We have to ensure that that trust in the banking system is always maintained. So how do we all participate in this new world moving forward so that we don't stifle that innovation? It's great, right? We need more of it, but how do we do it in a less cavalier way, right? While still protecting the user. It's our responsibility to protect our customers out there in terms of trust. So having the technical discussions around the security around our perimeter, those entry and exit points, whether it's API, outside of the traditional rails that Ursula talked about, is important moving forward. However, those conversations aren't as organic as we would like to have seen it, and this is globally, not just in South Africa. So that's where the standards and regulations now come into play as well. And it's important, and I'll give you a use case. So Dr. Ngcaba talked about business email compromise, right? And let's put a number to that. That's a $26 billion problem. That's reported losses globally since 2016, right? I believe this year's number, I think just for 2020, with the PPE scams and the rest of it, and these are cyber-enabled crimes. Syndicates that are traditional in cyberspace that we've been well versed with, as well as organized crime groups on the ground that have now got cyber enablement to it, that are playing in this space. I believe this year's number is well over 4 billion already, right, just with 2020. This is a growing problem. So when we look at risk across the landscape, we have to look at it in terms of cyber risk. It's not just from attacks on our firewall perimeters, platforms, Amazon Azure, our payment points, etc. We've got a lot of visibility and a lot of risk oversight in those areas. The logical attacks on the rest of our customers and the payments and the payments ecosystem in terms of the more complex and non-traditional participants is going to be important here. So $26 billion, and if we look at a threat like ransomware in terms of pure cybersecurity, right? You know, WannaCry was the big malware that ushered in the era of ransomware. WannaCry, when it hit many years back, I think it costed the global economy of an excess of $100 million. Now that's about 10 days worth of work in the BEC world. And that's why it's important. Now, if we come back to reading it back to how standards can make a difference in the banking world, if we look at something like ISO 20022, right, in terms of global payments, right, the ability to pass a lot more metadata when you're making a global payment from Banking South Africa to a bank overseas, right, where we can now tell you not just a lot more about that payment, but a lot more about the recipient and the account number tied back to that recipient. That's a level of awesomeness that's going to make a huge dent in the BEC world. Not alone, right? We need other compensating controls as well. But that's the importance. $26 billion since 2016. Let's contextualize it, right? Criminals innovate at the rate of knots. So pushing standards, pushing those agendas, getting regulators to talk, sharing our war stories, because the CISO alone within an organization is not going to solve this. It's an enterprise risk initiative across the landscape of global payments as we innovate moving forward and embrace that innovation, but balancing off these risks that we're talking about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think you spoke Ursula's language, and I want to give you a little bit of opportunity and see if we can get one more question in. We might even miss the audience questions because we've been getting stuck into this, which is fantastic. But let's see how it goes. Maybe Ursula, and I think Kovelin was alluding to that, so enriching sort of transaction data and so on around combating fraud and so on. Perhaps you can speak to us about, isn't this just all about fraud?
So, Gerhard, that's a very good question, and I think it's been hotly debated. But I don't think there's really been a definitive outcome in terms of is it just all about fraud. But let me just separate it, the three concepts for you. So today we've spoken about cybercrime, we've spoken about, well, we've touched a little bit about financial crime and then fraud. So the growing number of attacks is beginning to reveal that the lines are becoming increasingly blurred, and the definitions between cybercrime, financial crime and fraud are beginning to disappear. But if we just break it down, there are a couple of distinguishing factors between the three. And so if you look at cybercrime, which is really a criminal act focusing on computers and network, the overlap there is that you've got your identity theft, your online identity theft, and your financial fraud that happens over computers and networks, etc. But then there's also a distinction in that cybercrime also deals with things like bullying and hacking and email spoofing and stalking and intellectual crime property. Then you've got your financial crime, which is predominantly focused around your AML and your illicit trafficking and fraud, but focuses mainly on your compliance issue in terms of the crime and risk mitigation world. And then you come to the definition of fraud. So fraud is the use of deception to gain unlawful or dishonored advantage over somebody else, or the right to a victim, or the right of a victim. So one can argue that fraud would have to have happened first in order for any of the other two to have happened. But ultimately, at the end of the day, fraud mainly deals with the loss of a problem. But what we need to consider when we're talking about is it all just fraud, is that all these crimes linked to financial ruin or the potential ruin or a threat to an individual or an organization's reputation, as well as their personal safety and health. And they can be carried out by an individual, they can be carried out by a group, I think it's, as Kovelin refers to, or as a business as a whole. So whether it is all fraud or there's distinctions or nuances between the two, the question is that what Andile spoke to around the collaboration and the trust that Kovelin spoke to, is that all of this should really drive us towards the collaboration and how we can actually look at holistically and integratively deal with the mitigation, the prevention of fraud across all three disciplines, rather than separating the silos and trying to tackle it one on one.
I think that's great insight, and I think we're really out of time, which is fantastic because there's been some real nuggets. I mean, to summarize Andile's industry sort of collaboration, the focus on email authentication or at least validation around that being the root cause of many of the scams and so on. We're seeing the business email compromise. Kovelin's discussion around the ecosystem and protecting that, and standardization and regulation keeping up. And us really working together with how we transact and enrich transaction data, dealing with the increased cycle of innovation in the current financial system without upsetting it. I think great insights. And then Ursula, from your side, absolutely, just this need for collaboration and working together. It is crucial in the cybersecurity world, and it's something we've probably been struggling with over the last couple of years, but it is maturing and we are getting better. We just need to do more, I guess, with a wide variety of new stakeholders as well. But I think with that, let's see if we got any audience questions, and we can perhaps get a feedback on the poll. I don't know if there's any time left, but thank you. Back to the studio.
Thank you so much for the engaging conversation. There has been a couple of questions that have come through, so we'll allocate some questions to it. One is particularly just around, email, right? So if you're using end-to-end encryption, what part of the email, I guess, is really, really protected? So there's really, people are trying just to figure out, how safe is it really? It's really a big question. And then another question that came through is really around the scams, right? So what are some of maybe the more less known, but kind kind of really, really emerging scams that people need to have top of mind as they go forward. Thank you, Gerhard.
I think it's great. I think I'm going to ask Andile just to talk around the difference between encrypting the mail and authenticating or validating the email. And then I'll ask Kovelin to chat to us a little bit about the scam trends. I think he'll be able to interject there well. Andile?
Yeah, I just maybe I'll take a bit of small detour to respond to that. I mean, I just wanted to, to tackle the second part. Advanced persistent threats, which some of them are state-sponsored, to attack big institutions, is a real threat today. And again, I want to suggest the use of threat intelligence platforms, not from a single company point of view, but across either a country or industry as a way of protecting basically institutions. Now back to email. Look, there are a number of technologies being used here. I mean, as I was saying, the biggest challenge we have sometimes it's not technology, it's people. I mean, we can build encryption, of whatever level. I mean, using modern mathematics and cryptography, either at a device level or network level or application level or software level or at a cloud level. But the biggest challenge, I think, more than anything, is human beings. Now, unfortunately, you cannot code human beings. Human beings are social beings. They are emotional beings. They get fired, they get hired. I mean, they get scolded in companies, and they get, depressed, and people react differently, basically. I mean, there's a lot of, if you look at the weakest link, it's sometimes I would define as at a psychological level. That is where the biggest challenge we have in cybersecurity is human and more than technology. And because a lot of these things on their own, you can build systems that actually are protected, which it will take a lot of time for people to be able to penetrate that. Don't get me wrong, it can be penetrated, but more often than not, it's human beings. And we have not yet figured it out, the issue of humans in this, for instance, value chain of security. That is our biggest challenge.
Agreed. And I think the other important piece to just note, encrypting the transmission is different from authorizing the user. So you can build a lot of security around making sure emails are not intercepted, but it still doesn't help you validate that it's a fraudster on the other side until you get into the identity and validation side, which I think is the trick with just introducing encryption alone. It's that identification and validation part that's tough. And maybe, Kovelin, you can just talk around the prevalence of the email scams a little bit. You alluded to it a little bit around numbers, but perhaps just again touch on it.
Yeah, great question there. So we know that there's multiple layers of technology that or security that we could implement around your email box, right, or your email system. We had a conversation, I think, with Google a year or two ago, and something interesting that they mentioned is less than 30% of all Gmail email addresses actually have two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication enabled, right? So to Dr. Nava's point, you can have all the best security, but if it isn't enabled, right? And let's bring in the other context of trust. We trust our inbox, right? And we've been taught to trust our inbox. I mean, we use emails in our personal lives, communicating with our kids, our family, our bankers, operating our business, our customers. So if you had to pretend for a moment that you had to give access to your mailbox to your boss, right? And we had to go through each of the folders in there, from the sent items, deleted items, etc., right? there's a lot of information that's in there that one could give a very good and holistic picture of who you are, what you do, how you speak in terms of the tone of your email, who's your private banker, sensitive GDPR, POPIA type, private data in terms of identity documents, company documents, supply chain information, etc. All that's sat in your email box, right? Now, those are physical documents. You would think carefully about where you would leave them. You wouldn't just leave them at your reception in a public building, would you? You'd have a lot of security in there, certainly behind a locked office or a safe or etc., right? But this sits in our email box, which is open 24/7 on the internet with a basic password, a basic simple password. So once bad guys get into that, whether it's a up-and-coming criminal or a large organization with automated platforms to get into mailboxes, etc., right? The scam is about social engineering, because once I'm in, I know you are, I know what you look like, it begins to sound like a Liam Neeson movie at some point. But really, it's as simple as that, because once they have that, they are of the utmost con artists. So you could quite easily receive a call from your bank, saying that there's been a large transaction from your account, and your account number is X, Y, and Z, and your ID number is X, Y, and Z, or passport number X, Y, and Z, your address is X, Y, and Z, all from your mailbox, by the way. So you have a deep trust in whoever you speak to, and the sense of urgency is there. The narrative keeps changing from time to time. So when we are in COVID, it's about, so you can expect some vaccine news from bad guys in your mailbox soon, right? So the narrative would have changed from PPE now to vaccines, how to short circuit certain things, pretending to be from the NHS, or insert your hospital or regulator's name here for the medicines body in your country. And the narrative changes, but the data set is the same, the entry point is the same, and with the clever tier 1 syndicates, they use the cyber breach data that's available out there in terms of data breaches to enhance what they're looking at, to ensure that you fall for it. So it's as simple as that. Protect your inbox, ensure you're educating your customers. It's as simple as multi-factor authentication and verifying, as you said, verifying who you're speaking to.
Absolutely, and I think that underlines Dr. Ngcaba's points around his highlighting of email, and then also the fact that the human factor is probably our weakest link. So absolutely right. Thank you.